When I was 12 years old, my grandfather told me something I didn't truly understand. The meaning stayed hidden until the night I turned 18. His name was Harold, and he was the kind of man who believed actions spoke louder than words. He could repair almost anything with his hands, and whenever he had something important to say, he spoke so quietly that you had to pay attention. The summer I turned 12, he drove me 40 minutes to our family cabin on Cedar Lake. We spent the morning replacing old fence posts that had started to rot. He showed me how to press my thumb into the wood to test its strength. "If it gives way," he said, "it's already finished." That evening, after brushing the sawdust from his hands, he stood looking across the lake. Then he turned to me and said, "This cabin will always stay in the family, Sarah. But remember, family isn't always about blood. Family is the people who choose to show up when it matters." At 12 years old, I thought he was simply being thoughtful, so I smiled and forgot about it. Even so, I kept returning to the cabin every weekend that summer. Slowly, it became a second home. I learned which window always stuck during humid weather, where the water heater leaked after heavy rain, and how to bleed the old radiator before winter arrived. My grandmother, Vivian, insisted that the bookshelf should always be arranged by color because, according to her, it made every room feel warmer and more welcoming. At the time, I had no idea that while we were making those memories, my grandfather was already meeting with a lawyer, making plans for that very cabin, and quietly planning my future. Life at home in Richmond was comfortable enough, but it never felt warm. My younger sister had the larger bedroom with freshly painted lavender walls, matching furniture, and an expensive reading lamp. My room still had worn carpet left behind by the previous owners. One evening during dinner, my father looked up from his plate and casually said, "Dad's cabin is just sitting there losing value. We should sell it and invest the money somewhere useful." I quietly reminded him, "Grandpa always said the cabin should stay in the family." My father laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was the sort that dismissed everything I believed. "Sarah," he said, "you were only 12. He was just saying something nice." No one asked what I thought after that. The conversation immediately shifted to my sister's latest debate trophy, while the ribbon I had won at the science fair remained forgotten inside my backpack. My grandfather passed away when I was 14. During the reception after his funeral, I noticed my father and my uncle standing near the dessert table. Neither of them was eating. My uncle held a thick folder under his arm while they spoke in quiet voices. As I walked by, I heard my father say, "We should move on this before probate becomes complicated." I didn't need anyone to explain what they were discussing. They were talking about the cabin. I stayed silent because I was only 14. I had no authority, no influence, and no one was interested in hearing my opinion. What I didn't realize then was that my grandfather had already anticipated that exact moment long before it happened. 2 years later, my grandmother Vivian became seriously ill. During my final visit, she held my hand with surprising strength despite how weak she looked. She stared directly into my eyes and whispered, "The cabin belongs to you, Sarah. Don't let them take it away. Promise me." Without hesitation, I answered, "I promise, Grandma." She squeezed my hand one last time before peacefully closing her eyes. Later that evening, after her funeral, I walked past the garage and overheard my father talking on the phone. "Yeah," he said with a lighter voice than I'd heard in weeks. "Let's get everything moving." I stood quietly in the hallway holding a glass of water, and in that moment, something heavy settled deep inside me. I realized that my grandmother's passing wasn't simply a heartbreaking loss to everyone in the family. For at least one person, it was the beginning of an opportunity. After that night, I didn't cry. Instead, I made a promise to myself. Every Saturday for the next 2 years, I drove out to the cabin before sunrise. I repaired the torn porch screens, replaced worn weather stripping around the doors, and climbed onto the roof to sweep away the pine needles because Grandpa had always said that's where leaks begin. I cared for that place as if it were already my responsibility. While I spent my weekends protecting it, my father and uncle were making plans to get rid of it. My uncle had even found a buyer, a development company willing to pay $450,000. There was only one problem. He had agreed to sell a property without ever confirming that it actually belonged to him. 3 months before my 18th birthday, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Margaret Caldwell. She had served as my grandparents' attorney for 6 years. She asked me to come to her office alone. The room smelled of old books, paper, and freshly brewed coffee. Without wasting time, she opened a thick file, removed a document, and slid it across the desk. 6 years ago, she explained, your grandparents created an irrevocable trust. Inside that trust are the cabin, a savings account, and an investment portfolio. She looked at me before quietly adding, The total value is approximately $2.1 million, and you are the sole beneficiary. For a moment, I couldn't process what I had just heard. My mind went completely blank. Margaret continued speaking. The title to the cabin was transferred into the trust 6 years ago. Legally, your father has never owned it, and neither has anyone else in your family. They don't know this. At that moment, my grandfather's words echoed in my mind as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Margaret then shared something he had told her years earlier. My sons will try to sell that cabin before the flowers from my funeral have even faded. He had seen everything coming long before I was old enough to understand why. She also mentioned that someone had recently been asking questions about the cabin's ownership at the county recorder's office. From that day forward, I watched everything far more carefully. The following Sunday, I overheard another conversation in the garage. My uncle sounded confident. I've already signed the purchase agreement, $450,000. We just need to straighten out the title before closing. My father asked what they needed to do next. My uncle answered without hesitation. We'll file a quitclaim deed, transfer it to ourselves, record it, and finalize the sale. Simple. After a brief silence, my father asked quietly, "What about Sarah?" My uncle laughed. "She's only 17. She can't stop us. By the time she turns 18, the sale will already be finished." I slowly stepped away from the door, my hands trembling from the cold realization. My uncle had already signed a legally binding contract for a cabin he didn't own, built on property protected by a trust he didn't even know existed. My 18th birthday arrived with balloons hanging from the ceiling, silver letter banners across the living room, and nearly 20 relatives gathered to celebrate. There was a bakery cake from Main Street, wrapped gifts stacked on the table, and smiling faces everywhere I looked. I thanked everyone politely, opened each present, and acted as though nothing had changed. Hidden inside the pocket of my jacket, neatly folded into a small square, was the signed acceptance paperwork that officially confirmed I was now the legal beneficiary of everything my grandparents had protected for me. From that moment on, the future they thought they controlled had quietly slipped out of their hands. On the evening of my 18th birthday, I had already signed the acceptance documents the moment the clock struck midnight. During the party, my father stood beside the cake, tapped his glass, and smiled at everyone. "Sarah is officially an adult today," he announced. Then he looked directly at me. "As a family, we have some exciting plans ahead. Isn't that right, Sarah?" Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me. I forced a small smile and simply replied, "Thanks, Dad." Nothing more. He laughed, assuming I was being shy, and everyone raised their glasses with him. A little later, he stood again, speaking louder so the entire room could hear. "Our family has been through a difficult couple of years. Harold and Vivian left us the cabin at Cedar Lake, and together we've decided it's time to sell it so everyone can have a better future." He smiled at me confidently. "Sarah understands. She knows it's the right decision for all of us. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" I quietly placed my fork on the plate. The soft clink echoed through the suddenly silent room. Then I looked at him and said, "I never agreed to sell the cabin, Dad." My Uncle Greg immediately stepped forward with an uneasy smile. "Sarah, this isn't the time for this conversation." I calmly lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it back on the table. "You're right, Uncle," I answered while holding his gaze. "This isn't the time. The time is 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." The room fell completely silent. That night, my father followed me upstairs and warned that if I refused to cooperate, he would stop paying for my college and make me leave the house. I listened without arguing, closed my bedroom door, and waited. At exactly 11:50 p.m., I opened my laptop. When the clock reached midnight, I signed the final legal documents as an adult and became the official beneficiary of my grandparents' irrevocable trust. While I completed the paperwork, my uncle's sign sales contract was sitting in a folder downstairs, completely unaware that by morning it would already be worthless. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Margaret Caldwell walked through the doors of the county recorder's office carrying a leather folder. She calmly handed the clerk 2 documents, a certified copy of the irrevocable trust and a notice establishing the trust's legal interest in the property. The clerk reviewed everything, stamped the paperwork, and officially recorded it. From that moment on, anyone searching the title to the Cedar Lake cabin would see only one legal beneficiary, my name. A few minutes later, my uncle arrived with complete confidence, carrying his quitclaim deed, while my father followed behind with his hands in his pockets. The clerk examined the paperwork, checked the parcel number, and immediately frowned. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I can't record this document. The property is owned by the Maine Family Irrevocable Trust, and a legal notice was filed this morning. You'll need to speak with the trustee, Margaret Caldwell. My uncle placed both hands on the counter in disbelief. My father slowly turned toward him and quietly asked, "You told me this would be simple." Margaret had been sitting quietly in the waiting area the entire time. She watched them walk out without saying a single word. She didn't need to. Everything that followed spoke for itself. The development company filed a lawsuit against my uncle for breaching the purchase agreement, costing him $45,000 in penalties before additional damages were even considered. His real estate license was suspended, and prosecutors opened an investigation after questions arose about a forged notary stamp connected to the quitclaim. My father never challenged the trust in court because he knew there was no legal path to winning. A few days later, Margaret revealed something else my grandparents had planned years before. Alongside the cabin, they had quietly created an education fund that had continued growing for 6 years. By the time I inherited it, the account contained $58,000, the exact amount my uncle had once offered me as my so-called share of the cabin sale. My grandparents had already set aside that money long before anyone tried to cheat me. They had thought of everything. I didn't feel victorious after everything was over. Instead, I drove to the cabin at Cedar Lake, sat alone on the old porch, and unfolded the letter my grandfather had left behind. As I read his words, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not because I had lost anything, but because I realized how deeply I had been loved. My grandparents had quietly prepared for every possibility years before I ever understood what they were protecting me from. They couldn't change who my parents chose to be, but they made sure I would always have something solid beneath my feet when the truth finally came. That's what real family does. Family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by the people who stand beside you, protect you without asking for recognition, and make sure you're never alone when it matters most.